The detailed rabbit hole that is watch collecting can have a language all of its own, and deciphering the many types and styles of watches can be confusing for newcomers and even some more seasoned collectors. So what's the difference between a field watch, a Flieger? What are the different scales on a chronograph? Well, in this video, we'll go through the detailed list of styles of watches, a list of almost 40 watch types that I think every enthusiast should know. As a quick disclaimer, many of these categories are not really capable of an objective or universal definition, and I've simply done my best here to share the most commonly accepted definitions and descriptions for these popular categories. Also, the goal for this is to give some context to these types as a way to recognize patterns in your own collecting. Maybe you see some chronographs you like, and the reason for it is you like bicompacts layouts rather than tricompacts. But connecting styles to define themes, I think, are just important in improving your ability to collect going forward. And before we jump in, we do have some new and exciting stock that just landed on teddybaldassarre.com. First, the Baume & Mercier Riviera, now available at 39 millimeters. Takes this Ball-matic caliber 5-day power reserve, 39 millimeter case. And one thing I think people probably don't remember or think about when looking at Baume & Mercier, 6th oldest brand in Swiss watchmaking when you're talking about current production. And also the Riviera goes back to 1973, 3 years before the Nautilus even came out. So if you're talking about being at the center of that integrated sports trend, they were right there. Next, the Mito decompression world timer. It's funky in its design style with a decompression scale, true GMT movement on the inside with some world time functionality, 40.5 millimeter case, but wears like a 39 millimeter on wrist, and all of that under $1,500. In addition, we also have some new Nomos Club models and some older familiar faces if you want to get lost in, I would say, one of the best points of value in German watchmaking. Check this out and a lot more in the description down below, and shop around on teddybaldassarre.com. How we're able to fund all of our productions here is through selling watches. So if you are in the market for a watch, we'd love to have your business. Now, to kick us off here, I'm just going to call this general category, and then we're going to actually get into the types underneath this as sports. You can include a lot here, and I'm just going to call this as anything that has some sporty upside, whether it's racing, diving, or other active pursuits. Now, first, let's start with a less known one. This is the Regatta, and it's a watch with a specialized timer, usually color-coded with its scale, that actually counts down as opposed to up to allow for perfect timing for the beginning of a sailing/boating race. Next, we have integrated. This refers to watches where the case and bracelet meet with some kind of non-traditional lug style, specifically designed to merge seamlessly without perceived separation. The original pioneer of this was the Royal Oak, but it now extends to all different price ranges and styles. Next, we have the field watch, and this gets thrown around quite a bit. This is generally designed for the rough and tumble outdoor use, with many of the top names in the world stemming from military designs, primarily from World War II. With a field watch, you can expect some Arabic indices, usually a 24-hour scale, and heavy contrast for legibility. Now, rather than hands rotating around a circular dial, a digital watch uses an electronic and dynamic display of numerals or digits to display the time. These are almost always utilizing quartz oscillators. Next, we have the analog digital watch. This is a combination of rotating hands and a digital display, perhaps best exemplified by something like the Seiko Arni. Next, we have the everyday watch. This is kind of my own terminology, and I will often use this to describe a versatile watch that offers a sporty upside without losing versatility in formal scenarios. Although I'm not completely strict about what is needed for an everyday watch, I would say that ideally it has 100 meters of water resistance, sapphire crystal, to go along with a flexible design style. Next, we have one of the most popular and basic categories, the dive watch. Here we're looking at the basic dive watch format, pairs water resistance with a rotating elapsed time bezel with high legibility with luminescent markings. And then to go along with that, we have a different dive watch and a different style here that deserves specific shout, and that is the compressor style, which gets its classification from super compressor cases, a dual crown design with an internal bezel that was made by EPSA in the 1960s and 70s and used by dozens of brands. Nowadays, the term is generally referring to any dive watch with an internal bezel and 2 crowns. So this next category is going to be all things chronograph, basically a watch that has a built-in stopwatch feature that have separate scales for timekeeping and functions. When looking at chronographs, there are many different scales, many different layouts, and that all creates a different experience. So let's go through some of those. Now, a tachometer is a chronograph with a scale typically located on the bezel or along the outside of the dial, and this allows for estimating the speed of something like a race car or a plane over a period of time. As a wearer, you would simply start the chronograph at the beginning of a race or the beginning of a measured distance, and if it took 30 seconds to complete the kilometer, the chronograph's second hand would be stopping and pointing at 120, meaning that the vehicle traveled 120 kilometers an hour. Next, we have the telemeter. This is a scale that can be used to calculate the distance between an event that can both be seen and heard. In a vintage context, this was commonly used on the battlefield to measure the distance of enemy artillery fire. A modern example that I will bring up, and I actually have a short explaining this, is tracking lightning and how far away it is from you at a moment during a lightning storm. Basically, when you would see the lightning, you would initiate the chronograph, and then when you would hear the thunder, you would stop, and looking at the scale would determine your distance. Now, next up, we have the pulsometer. Now, it is important to mention that although we're putting this under chronographs, there are other watches out there that will have a pulsation scale on the outside. This is typically used by medical professionals to calculate heart rate or heartbeats per minute in much of the same way a tachometer is used to track speed. You would start the chronograph function and then either count to 15 or 30 beats, depending on the particular scale, and then would stop the chronograph, and the seconds hand will be pointing to the calculated beats per minute. While general operation of a chronograph involves starting and stopping the chronograph with the top pusher, and then resetting or zeroing the chronograph by pressing the bottom pusher, the flyback can be used to track multiple intervals in quick succession as one touch of the pusher both resets and restarts the chronograph. Useful for timing instantaneous events like timing a series of laps in a race, or for pilots back in the day when calculating distance for coordinates. Next is the seldom seen decimeter, which provides a scale breaking down into 1/100ths. It basically is an essential metric for many scientific and engineering pursuits. Compared to either a simple chronograph or the flyback, both of which can only time one event at a given time, there's also the rattrapante, also called a split second or double chronograph. The rattrapante allows for timing multiple events at the same time that start together but don't necessarily end together, thanks to an entire additional chronograph seconds hand. Then we have layouts. So let's talk about the tri-compacts. This is a chronograph with 3 sub-registers or subdials used to display the various functions of a particular chronograph caliber. An example might be hours with one sub-register, running seconds on the other, and then minutes on the third. And then, as you'd expect from the last category, another popular one is the bicompacts layout. This is a chronograph with only 2 sub-registers, often associated with mid-century designs. Next, we're going to move into travel style watches, and there are many different watches that can be included here. Easily the most popular travel category, the GMT, includes an additional hand or indicator in a 24-hour format to track additional time zones. It tends to typically include a rotating bezel that can be used to quickly cross-reference the time in different parts of the world, as seen in the GMT Master family. Next, the World Timer. This is a complication that has a 24-hour scale, but also includes corresponding cities to represent every time zone in order to see different times in the world at a glance. Then you have the dual time display. This is a format that allows tracking of 2 separate time zones on a dial that is typically on a 12-hour scale. Usually they'll do this with a separate subdial or indicator to display the second time zone, like the Patek travel time. Now, this next category generally refers to watches intended for refined settings, and I'm going to call this a dress category. And I will admit the terms and definitions are a bit more subjective here than some of the other places, yet I do think it's important to kind of talk about this and give an appropriate call out to them in this video. Now, at least for me, a classic dress watch offers timeless or historically informed design elements such as brigade numerals or hands, engraved Arabics or Roman numerals, or using handcrafted arts like guilloche dials, for example. The definition of a sector dial can vary a bit depending on who you ask, but you're generally going to be looking for a series of concentric circles moving in from the dial outskirts, with each of these circles often linked by straight lines at the hour positions. This design style has become synonymous with classic 1930s and 40s watches and has recently seen a bit of a resurgence in popularity, usually in more formal contexts. And as a little bit of a call out right now, I'm wearing one on my wrist. This is the Longines Sector Dial Heritage Classic Sector, probably one of the best points of value when you're talking about sector dials on the market, in my opinion. Now, this next one, kind of silly, pretty much on the nose, and it is exactly what it sounds like, a rectangular case. This is a watch that is shaped like, well, a rectangle, with iconic models like the Cartier Tank, the JLC Reverso, being some of the first to spring to mind among others. Given some of the challenges of water resistance when it comes to rectangular and square cases, these are commonly reserved for the arena of dress watches. Another one we have to mention are going to be ultra thin watches. So this is going to be a watch designed with extra slender profiles in mind. There are numerous dress watch options from brands like Breguet, JLC, Vacheron, Piaget. All of them qualify here, but we do have to mention that this is not just exclusive for dress watches, but are going to commonly be associated with the dress category more than others. One of my personal favorites, the moon phase, refers to watches with a separate display graphically indicating the phase of the moon. This is also often paired with different types of calendar watches that we will certainly get to soon. However, it is not to be confused with an AM/PM indicator, which might also have some lunar motif, but only as a way to indicate day and nighttime hours. Now we're shifting into pilot watches designed for pilots, aviation professionals. Despite this being a little bit harder to identify compared to something like a dive watch when it comes to classifications, you're generally going to find low pressure resistance as well as a focus on legibility. Now, one of the most popular ones is going to be the term Flieger, and this refers to a design format created by the German Air Force during World War II with the BWR, which is German for observer's watch. The original big five that were producing these watches were A. Lange & Söhne, Laco, Stova, Vempi, and IWC, and were a massive 55 millimeters in diameter intended to be worn over a flight jacket. Their defining characteristics nowadays are large numerals, an orientation triangle at 12, onion-style crowns, and heavy contrast on the dial. While they're rare, an altimeter watch can measure altitude, the distance of a point above sea level, and can be done either with battery-powered tech, as you'll find with some Citizen models, or the rare mechanical options from brands like Oris. Another format often associated with aviation is the Big Eye, which is a chronograph where one register is proportionally much larger than the other. The Longines Avigation Big Eye is an excellent example of this. It is based on a model from the 1940s. The idea here is that the sub-register with the most important information is the easiest to read. And now we move into calendar watches. There are several different types. They can be slightly confusing, but once you understand the differences, it's easy to navigate this a bit more easily. Now, the triple calendar indicates the day, date, and month, but does not account for longer and shorter months, requiring resetting 5 times a year for the months that are going to be less than 31 days. Then you have the annual calendar. This picks up where the triple calendar drops off, indicating the day, date, month on an annual basis, automatically accounting for changes between the months. However, annual calendars do not take into account leap years. The pinnacle of calendar watches is the perpetual calendar, which utilizes a highly complicated caliber that takes into account the day, date, month, even taking leap years into account, making for a watch that doesn't need resetting until long into the future, with many modern perpetuals that are tracked in the year being good up until 2100, if not longer. Now we move into audible watches. When I say audible, I'm referring to watches that make a sound or a noise by mechanical means, which is typically executed with internal gongs and tiny hammers. An alarm watch has an independent set mechanical function where an audible alarm will sound at a specified time. This is typically executed with an additional hand for the alarm setting. The JLC Memovox and Revive Volcane Cricket are both great examples of this. And given that this was intended to be loud and get your attention, or in some cases wake you up, it's not made to be very soothing to listen to compared to some other chiming mechanisms in watches, but it certainly does the job. Let's give the Volcane Cricket a quick listen. Now, a minute repeater is another highly complicated and typically very expensive complication in a watch that chimes in a series of tones to indicate the time by way of internal gongs and hammers. The traditional way to tell time is a unique chime for every hour, each 15-minute or quarter, and then a final chime for each individual minute. Decimal minute repeaters are a little bit different. They swap the second chime, indicating every 10 minutes rather than every 15 or quarter. I'm gonna let 1 minute repeater play right here, just the audio, and you can tell us the time in the comments. Next up, we have accuracy, and I know accuracy as a category is kind of a stretch, but there are a number of types of watches that lean into accurate related issues or timekeeping or chronometry issues that I think have their own subgenre. The word most commonly thrown around with highly accurate mechanical watches is a chronometer, a term that refers to mechanical watches that have been certified by COSC, the official Swiss Chronometer Testing Institute, that tests calibers and certifies them to be accurate within -4 to +6 seconds per day while being subjected to many tests. There are other testing bodies and brands that have testing standards that are impressive as well. However, COSC really is the standard in which others are measured as a benchmark. Now, moving over to quartz watches, we have a concept of high accuracy quartz movements and watches themselves, which refers to exactly what it sounds like by usually featuring higher frequency quartz calibers that are very accurate. Standard quartz caliber oscillation is based on a quartz crystal's blistering pace of 32,768 cycles per second and typically accurate to around ±15 seconds per month, whereas high accuracy quartz calibers can be multiples of this. A popular example of this is with Bulova and their high frequency quartz movements that have an oscillating frequency of 262,144 cycles per second, which allows for accuracy around ±10 seconds per year. Also, many high accuracy quartz calibers, whether they're higher frequency or not, are also thermal compensated to avoid deviation based on temperature. And while it's not closely associated with accuracy today, I also want to mention the tourbillon because its original purpose was to compensate for the ill effects of gravity on the movement when dealing with pocket watches and positional error if you had your watch in your pocket all day. By taking the balance wheel and the escapement wheel on a rotating cage, the tourbillon helps mitigate the effects of positional error on a movement. Given that watches nowadays are on our wrists, tourbillons are not seen as necessary. Instead, they are a hallmark of high watchmaking prowess. And now this is more of a general term that doesn't fit anywhere else on the list, but I did want to include it, and that is a micro rotor watch, which refers to the oscillating weight or rotor featured on an automatic caliber that is proportionally downsized and doesn't take up the entirety of the movement's diameter. In addition, they are also typically utilized to keep thickness of a caliber down, usually sitting in a recessed area of a bridge or bridges, famously used by brands like Breguet or Universal Genève. And for our last category, we have regulator, the regulator watch, which is a watch display type where the minutes are indicated by a large centrally located center hand and the hours and seconds each having their own sub-registers. The history here is that for watchmakers who all wanted to remain coordinated with their timing and setting of watches, used a special regulator clock that placed the minutes first and foremost for easy detection. But all right, guys, that is 40 different types of watch categories that you should know as an enthusiast. And hopefully with some of the watches featured here, you were able to identify maybe some styles you like, some different complications you like. All of these are different routes you can take. I know there are so many watches to get lost in, but how I like to think about things and how my brain works is I like to break things down to a simpler form. What are the different things that I should be aware of? And then I could use that as a way of researching further in the future for things that I like and find trends that have my just own taste so I can develop it even further. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon, really would appreciate that. Also definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. And how we're able to create content like this on the channel is through selling watches on our site. So if you are in the market for a watch, we'd love to have your business. It allows us to keep doing what we're doing here, and we love what we do. Guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.